Hello, and thank you for joining us for our Cybersecurity webinar series. NBT Bank's President of Retail Community Banking and Chief Information Officer Joe Stagliano will kick off our event today, followed by our featured presentation. At this time, I'll turn the program over to Joe.
Hello, I'm excited to kick off the third session of our cybersecurity series. Earlier in my career, I had the opportunity to be involved in the first educational events on this topic, so I'm really excited to provide the introduction for our presenters and topic today. Today you're going to hear from Tara Carnick-Granata, Andy Frisbee, and Tucker Lounsbury. Tara leads our information security, cybersecurity, fraud, and third-party risk programs. She provides strategic and operational support to address the complex threat of our regulatory environments of the financial services industry. Now, Andy has a deep background in information technology, law enforcement, and consulting. As a member of our information security and fraud risk team, Andy plays a strategic role in helping protect our customers' information and assets. Tucker's experience in all aspects of the insurance industry, from being an underwriter to becoming an insurance broker and agency owner, and ultimately leading NBT Insurance. A certified insurance counselor, Tucker uses his experience to counsel clients on the best protection to fit their unique needs. Now, I'll ask Tara to kick off the conversation on effective incident response. Tara, it's all yours.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone. So we're happy to have you here for week 3, and I want to quickly go over the agenda that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk to you about the fundamentals of incident response planning, some basic response and playbooks for ransomware attack and business email compromise in a 365 environment, and then a 5-step action plan that you can take away with today. So let's talk a little bit about incident response and what it is. Incident response is the systematic process for responding to active or perceived threats. And this would be against the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your information systems or data. They say that every 39 seconds, there's a cyber incident taking place. So time is now to plan for any event. So let's talk about the benefits of planning for incident response. I'm going to start with the right with no prior planning. If you don't plan for incident response, it will cause chaos, fear, uncertainty, possible financial or reputational harm, also regulatory exposure. But if you sit down with your key stakeholders of your company and plan out what an incident response or a cyber incident could be, you're going to have that adaptability. You're going to have that confidence to know what to do when something takes place. You're also going to have the options by having playbooks available that will mitigate or stop any potential harm and also reduce exposure and costs. President Eisenhower said plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So it is so essential to make sure you're planning for any single event that could occur. I want to talk a little bit about 4 phases of incident response, and that's what we're going to focus the rest of the morning on. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, has broken out incident response into 4 phases, or 4 key pillars, as I like to say: preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activity. And I'm going to kick it off with Tucker covering preparation. Tucker?
Great. Thanks, Tara. So we're going to start here at the foundation of it all. It's really important that this foundation is complete because everything that comes with incident response starts from this foundation. The first 2 bullets, assembling a team and having the right tools in place, along with an incident response plan, should come from hopefully having procured an insurance policy and working to develop who those teams, who the tools, and what the tools will be that you'll use if or when you end up having an attack. It's really important, depending on size of company, to know that these teams are going to be comprised of internal people and likely external people. As the size of the company expands, you're going to find you're going to have more and more external people and different types of services that you're going to need. But at the same time, think about being a small operation and think about how many folks you're going to have to rely on externally because you don't have the internal team to rely on. So put that team together, work with your insurance company to formalize a response plan in advance of that attack or breach so that you have something you can grab readily available and know how to execute on incident response. Understanding the claim process in advance is another really, really important focus item, I'd say, that you have to understand as soon as a breach happens. First of all, we all typically will panic when we have a breach or an incident happen, and we start to try to fix it or to respond to it. Really, the first thing that needs to happen, especially if you're an insured client, is that you need to call your insurance company. There you're going to get some advice from breach coaches. Those are typically attorneys, and you're going to end up having a discussion on whether you need to bring attorney involvement in right away, or if there's other steps that need to be taken. Getting your attorney-client privileges established up front is one of the most critical components of this incident response. So I want to really make sure that we talk about how critical that is as a first step. Then I think you need to also move on to say, what's most likely to happen to us? And I think in the previous 2 series, we ended up talking a lot about business email compromise and ransomware. We want to make sure that you go through the process to understand with these 2, what's our playbook going to look like? Make sure you develop a basic playbook. And then finally, I'll just say here, most of us work with third-party IT firms. Whether you're a small firm and you heavily rely on a managed service provider, need to make them part of this entire preparation process. Bring them into the fold early, involve them with your insurance companies, and make sure the whole team is ready to go. Now I'm going to turn it over to Andy, and he's going to get you right into detection analysis. Andy?
Thanks, Tucker. Thanks, Tara, for that great lead up. Detection and analysis is really the second phase of incident response. And I'm going to walk you through what this means and how sort of this unfolds in an incident. Detection prior to impact requires visibility. It's a really important statement to understand, and I want to explain exactly what that means. The impact phase of an incident is really what is going to cause the damage and the financial harm to you. If you remember that cybercrime pain scale we showed in series 1, that's where BEC and ransomware live. That impact is where your devices get encrypted, or it's where after the email account is taken over, the attacker uses that to try to perpetrate a fraudulent transaction. If you want to detect a cyber attack prior to that impact phase, you have to have eyes on your systems. You have to create that visibility. Now, in all of the stages of an attack, the attacker is going to leave a trail, or they're going to leave breadcrumbs. If you remember when Tara and I walked you through in series 1, the perspective from the fraudster's point of view or from the attacker's point of view, that was a simplified attack chain. It broke down all the phases of the attack, from gaining access all the way to waiting for the money to arrive in their bank accounts. Now, there's multiple opportunities along the way to detect the trail that they're leaving or find those breadcrumbs. And if you want to be able to find those breadcrumbs and intervene before the impact occurs, you need to have eyes on your systems. In other words, early detection, the sooner you can detect the attack early on in that attack chain, the less impact the attacker is going to have in your environment. That's a really fundamental concept to understand with incident response planning. The analysis phase of incident response really requires tools and expertise. And this is where your cybersecurity experts, whether they're in-house or they're contracted, are going to drill into the who, what, when, where, and how aspects of this. The first thing they're going to do is determine if you actually even have an incident. So we see events all the time, right? And we see if you have tools and you're monitoring your systems, these events are going to trigger constantly. The first thing you need to do is determine whether that event constitutes some kind of suspicious or malicious action that you need to follow through on. And so the tools and expertise required to do this are going to vary depending on the sophistication of the attack. But this is really where you drill in and start figuring out what happened. Finally, you really need to understand what your capabilities are as an organization. And this includes your in-house capabilities, what IT staff do you have on board, what are their skills? Small and medium-sized businesses are at a disadvantage here typically because their IT staffs are lean, and they may have 1 or 2 or 3 people, and those people are focused on different things. You need to know if you outsource your IT to a managed service provider, what are their capabilities? And then finally, if you're hiring a third-party cybersecurity firm to either do proactive or incident response work, you need to understand what they have for experience, because in incident response, experience is everything. You want people in your environment who have seen these attacks over and over and over again, and this is what they do on a day-to-day basis. Now, I want to comment on one thing, and that's the difference between information technology and cybersecurity. So a lot of times these two functions get commingled, but they're really very different skill sets. And information technology professionals are experts in building and designing systems, system optimization and uptime, supporting the business with information technology functions. And out of necessity, they've developed some skills in security, but that's not their expertise typically. And so when it comes to incident response, you need to understand where their skills sort of max out in the security realm so that you can backfill with third-party cybersecurity expertise, the folks that do incident response every day. Moving on to the containment, eradication, and recovery phase of incident response. So there's a lot going on here. In the containment phase, this is typically where we isolate the affected system. So what does that mean? In the case of a ransomware incident, it's a bit of a misnomer that you want to unplug and power down the affected systems. Certainly that's better than doing nothing at all, but if you have the ability to isolate the system from your environment, that will stop the infection from spreading, and it will preserve the evidence, especially the evidence that's left in the memory of your computer, for those expert investigators to come and gain really valuable intelligence and information about who perpetrated the attack and how they did it. Now, there's lots of ways to contain the threat, and it can be a manual process, or preferably, because you've gone through the planning phase and you've selected the appropriate endpoint protection tools, there's an automated process there, or there's something in between where your system is alerting you to the fact that there's suspicious activity and a human being comes in and makes the decision to isolate that device. That's all within the realms of today's technology. The next step, eradication, really involves identifying where the threat has spread throughout your environment and removing it from your environment, removing all the enablers of the attack. Now, this phase of incident response can be incredibly sophisticated and require a high degree of expertise, especially if this is an advanced attacker. So, for example, if you're dealing with an attacker that is a nation state or a group sponsored by a nation state, then they're likely to have conducted surveillance. They're likely to have planted multiple backdoors in your environment. So when you start knocking off the first one or the second one, they've got a third mechanism to connect to your environment. We call that persistence. So it takes a lot of effort to get in, and the attacker wants to maintain that stickiness to your environment. And they do that through establishing persistence. And so your incident responders have to find all that and remove it from your environment. Further, when we talk about compromised networks, we're dealing with compromised user accounts. And remember, we talked about in series 1 how the attacker's objective is to get to the most privileged account in your environment and compromise that account. Well, when they do that, there's a web of connections that compromised account has previously done, and all of those need to be examined during an incident response. Finally, the incident responders need to identify the communication networks that the attackers are using to communicate with the malware inside your environment and potentially to exfiltrate data from your environment. Those are really complicated tasks if you have an advanced attack. So you need to have the right expertise on board to get that done properly. Finally, the recovery phase. So the recovery phase of incident response is actually going to begin right during the response. Now, hopefully you've done excellent planning and you've identified your critical business systems, and those might be systems that are required to keep your business up and running. They might be customer-facing systems. Regardless, you know where they are, you know where your critical data is. So right away, you're in your incident response, you're going to identify whether your critical systems are impacted, and you're going to start working out a plan to bring those systems back online. Remember, we're not just dealing with business continuity here, we're dealing with brand and reputation damage potentially, and so it's important to get those critical systems operational quickly. Now, another critical part of your planning phase is going to be resiliency. It's going to be backup and restoration of data. And hopefully you've done that planning and you have that available to you. This is where you're going to take the clean backups that have been isolated from your environment and kept away from the attacker's reach, and you're going to use those to restore into your environment. And that's the recovery phase of this. It's going to get you out of out of a ransomware attack, for example. In a BEC attack, and we'll walk through that, it's really about getting the attacker out of your system. And when we talk about the playbook there, we're gonna explain exactly how to do that. I'm going to kick it back to Tucker to talk about the last phase of incident response. That's post-incident activity.
Great. Thanks, Andy. That's a lot of good detail there. So you've had an incident, or like I'd like to say, maybe you've just had a near miss. And those are different. An incident, obviously you're in the thick of it. You've gone through a major problem in your company, or perhaps you had an anomaly. Your IT people noticed something. Maybe you had a blip or an attempt, but maybe it was a failed attempt. So the first piece of this is to make sure you learn from every single event. And again, I say these near misses, they're probably the most important ones to take the time on, because you've triggered your team, you've triggered your response, and hopefully it was a near miss. But then you have to go through, what could we have done better? Why did this happen? And you have to think about, do you have an improved response? Were we fast enough? Did we make the right calls? So don't celebrate the near miss because you didn't have the big breach that takes the company down or offline for a certain amount of time. Just make sure you bring that team back together, take them to task, talk about the systems. Everything is moving so quickly. You know, Andy mentioned that you've got these nation states that are working and very highly financed to do this kind of evil work. And we have to be always moving and getting ahead of the curve. Because you put systems in place 5 years ago, doesn't mean that they're going to work today. So improve those systems, especially after you've had an incident, to make sure that you're ready for the next one. And then talk about maybe, you know, what are the skills? Skills are always changing. Do you need different people on that team? Your vendors, do you need to reorganize or bring different types of vendors in? And I'm amazed in watching cyber insurance. We've been dealing with this for 10 years, and we're doing completely different things today than we were doing 10 years, all for the better, to stay one step ahead. The last piece I'll mention is policy coverages. And if you're insured, it's important to make sure you check with your insurance company to understand, boy, we had a firewall that didn't work, or we didn't have the right firewall. There is some coverage in a lot of the policies that you're buying today that allow you to have some improvement coverage so that you can invest using your insurance policy in some of the newer tools that you might need. These are always sublimited. They're not high limits. It might be up to $100,000. But if you have that near miss, if you have a small loss, or if you have that big loss, always make sure you question and go through that process with your insurance team on whether you've got those coverages there. And if you've had a big loss, clearly you're going to be working through to handle this claim, and it could be months that you're working on actually bringing that to resolution as you bring your systems online and take care of the business interruption activity that maybe you suffered. So now I'll kick it back over to Andy, and he's going to actually take you through some playbooks. We're going to do one on business email compromise and one on ransomware because they're so prevalent. So Andy, back to you.
Hey, thanks, Tucker. So it isn't realistic to develop a playbook for every possible cyber attack out there. It frankly would be a waste of time. But when you go through a risk analysis in your business, you will likely arrive at the conclusion that your business is exposed in some level to a business email compromise or ransomware attack. And as we talked about in the last two series, They're the most prevalent in our footprint and NBT's footprint, and certainly on the painful end of the cybercrime pain scale. And so we feel that it's worthwhile going through the effort of developing some simple playbooks for BEC and ransomware. Now, why Microsoft 365 only for BEC? Well, because most of our customers, frankly, are using Microsoft 365 today. And if you remember, the login pages in most cases for your Microsoft 365 email system are out there on the internet, and they're exposed to attackers to perpetrate credential stuffing attacks and other account compromise type scenarios. We talked about that in Series 1. So while I'm going through these playbooks, I want you to think how you could prepare for these two scenarios. We've already talked about some of that, but you'll hear me walk you through the various phases. I'm not going to talk about preparation just yet. In a BEC scenario, it's really important to learn the symptoms of business email compromise, because an attacker's objective when they compromise your email account is to hide their activity completely from you. And so you need to know how is that going to present to me as the user of the email system, right? If you expected an email from a customer that was finance related and it didn't arrive, well, you need to look into that and figure out why didn't it arrive. And Microsoft on their website gives a great bulleted list of all the symptoms that you can learn that will tell you how BEC will manifest from the user's perspective. In this detection and analysis phase, if you have your logging turned on in Microsoft 365, now's the time when you want to start checking it. This is where you're going to find the proof that your account, your 365 account has been compromised, or your individual email account has been compromised. But if you didn't turn your logging on, you still want to take this step and turn it on at this time. The reason is in Microsoft 365, logging is not retroactive. And at some point in time, somebody, whether it's your IT people or incident responders that are contracted or come by way of your insurance policy, are going to want to look at those logs. And you need to start generating that activity, if for no other reason than to validate that you've removed the attacker completely from your environment. The logs are also going to do one other thing for you, and it's really important. And that is they're going to give you a perspective on the total exposure. So remember, Microsoft 365, which used to be called Office 365 because it was focused on those Office tools, is no longer just an email system. It's now a file repository. It includes SharePoint, it includes Teams, it includes OneDrive. And when the attacker takes over your account, they assume the context and the privileges that you had. And if you had access to data in Teams or data in SharePoint, they can potentially get access to all those files. And the logs are going to show you what the extent of that access is. And finally, you need to call your insurance company here. And the reason is because you don't know what the scope of the exposure is at this point in time. Is it just an email account takeover? Did you stop the fraudulent transaction? Did you remove the attacker from the account? Or was their protected information exfiltrated from your system? You have to be mindful of the notification requirements of the SHIELD Act in New York and some other regulations. Contain, eradicate, and recover. What does this mean in terms of business email compromise? Well, as your financial partner, we are responsible for providing financial services and protecting your financial assets. And so in the case of a BEC, remember, we said this in the two prior series, NBT often becomes the target. Once your email account is compromised, the attacker's objective is to hide communication from you and start communicating with NBT to hopefully trigger some kind of fraudulent wire and steal money from your account. So in order for us to take the appropriate defensive measures, we want you to notify us early on in the process, as soon as you have a suspicion that your account's been taken over. Now, that's an appropriate time if you don't have the banking controls in place that Margaret talked to you about in Series 2. We're going to talk to you about it at this point in time, because we can turn on some very key banking controls to help protect those assets while the incident response is occurring. And finally, we want you to follow Microsoft's incident response plan. Microsoft, you can Google their how to respond to a business email compromise. They've got a step-by-step actionable plan that is designed to give you control back of your 365 environment and to kick the attacker out of that environment. We're not going to cover all that today, but I do want to cover the key elements of that playbook. First, you're going to want to reset the compromised user's password, and I would extend that to any user in your environment that has elevated privileges, like your global admins, or your finance people, and even your C-suite people. At this point, you may not know the scope of the compromise, so it's really important to get those passwords reset. Secondly, and the most important control you can put in place is multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is going to force the attacker out of your environment, even in the scenario where the password is compromised. And then finally, you're going to remove those forwarding rules that they may have put in place to forward email out to an external domain or to a folder in your inbox that you're not monitoring. We're going to move on to ransomware and walk you through a playbook here. The ransomware playbook, we've kind of already covered a little bit. I want to get into a little bit more detail. In the detect and analyze phase, the first thing you're going to do here is contact your insurance provider. And the reason for that is because you don't know what the scope of the attack is here. The other reason is, and it could be a very sophisticated attack for which you require all the expertise we talked about. But more importantly, you need to engage that breach response process and the attorney so that the incident responder and everything that you do internally is covered under privilege and doesn't get exposed in potential future litigation. Again, that expertise is going to be really critical, and you want to get that involved as soon as possible. You're also going to be discussing with your insurance provider and your business leaders at this point what options you have regarding the ransom itself. Now, hopefully you've done prior planning and you're not in a situation where you have to pay that ransom, but this is where you're going to start to talk about it, and your insurance provider is going to supply the negotiators and give you guidance on that particular decision. In the contain, eradicate, and recover phase of a ransomware response, this is where you're going to isolate the affected devices, and we talked about that previously, but my hope is that you'll implement a tool that allows you to do that automatically or with the click of a button through some brief human intervention. You're going to preserve the critical evidence here, and this is so your incident responders can do the investigation and hopefully attribute the attack to a group that gives them the insight they need to go find all of the elements of the attack in your environment and build a defense around it for the future. You're going to reset the passwords in your environment, much like in the BEC playbook, for your privileged users and maybe some senior people in your organization. And the incident responders are going to look in this stage for that web of connections that I spoke about. So just because one account was compromised, or two or three in the case of lateral movement, doesn't mean that's where you stop. Because in a Windows environment, you've got to expand your investigation a little bit beyond that. And so this is where you're gonna do that. And then finally, removing the threats. We've talked about that eradication phase. It can be a very complex process in an advanced ransomware attack, and this is going to require some serious expertise to make sure it's done right. And hopefully you've got clean backups and you can initiate the restore process on those backups. Now, one thing I'll say about the backups, and that is that you want to make sure that your backups are tested and meet your recovery time objectives. I've been in situations during incident response where the business thought they were going to be able to restore within 24 or 48 hours, and it took a week or more. So you want to make sure you know how your systems perform. The post-incident activity phase of ransomware is equally as important, and this is where you're going to go through your after-action review and figure out what happened. We've talked about that several times already. But in the case of ransomware, there's data out there that suggests once you've been breached, there's a higher risk that you'll become a target a second time, especially if you ended up paying a ransom. So your team in this phase really needs to understand how the attack happened so that they can build defenses against the same attack and similar attacks to prevent you from becoming a victim a second time around. Now I'm going to kick it back over to Tara, and she's going to walk you through a 5-step action plan that you can start working on immediately.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Tucker. So here's 5 steps that you can start taking immediately. Prepare yourself. We've talked so much about the threats. Creating a simple incident response plan. NIST, as I mentioned earlier, has tools and resources available to help you create a plan. develop responses for business email compromise and ransomware, and strategically invest in tools as you can to create that visibility and enable response. And then look into the appropriate insurance coverage that you need that will give you that expertise. All of these 5 steps will help your business today. So I want to thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next week as all of our presenters will be coming back to cover all of the questions and answers that were given, as well as we're going to dive into 2 case studies of ransomware and business email compromise. Thanks so much, and we hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
This concludes our event. We hope you'll join us again next Friday for our session, Cybercrime Survivors, Stories and Lessons Learned. Thank you.